Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the Chief Customer Officer's Fall and CXPA webinar. My name is Maisa Roberts. I'm a conference director and content producer with Corinium Global Intelligence. We're kicking off our webinar today on the topic of the impact of employee experience on customer experience. Humanize your organization to drive outstanding business results. I'd like to introduce all participants, starting with our moderator, Gabe Smith, Content Manager at CXPA. We also have Bob Asman, the Chairman of Board of Directors, CXPA, and founder of Innovative CX Solutions. We have Liliana Petrova, former Director of Customer Experience with JetBlue and founder of the Petrova Experience. We have Vishal Bal, employee and patient experience at a county hospital system with the busiest emergency in the country. We also have Richard Tourette, Associate Vice President of Experience Design at Wells Fargo. And Gary David, Professor of Sociology and User Experience at Bentley University and founder of Ethno Analytics, a consultancy that focuses on achieving integrated experience design. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. For attendees, we will be taking your questions during the webinar. Please feel free to type them on the Q&A box. And I'd now like to hand over to our moderator, Gabe Smith. Thank you, Gabe, for joining us once again.
Thank you, Maisa, and good afternoon, everyone. So excited to dive right into this discussion. So I thought we'd just start with some level setting. And Gary, I want to ask this question of you because, you know, I know people hear these terms bandied about. They hear employee experience and they hear employee engagement. So just to level set, is employee experience the same as employee engagement, or is that different?
Well, one of the nice things about a burgeoning new area is that you can almost say anything you want and not be wrong, which takes some of the pressure off. But in looking at a lot of literature and a lot of what's been coming out on the topic, you can think of it as a replacement of employee engagement or an extension of employee engagement as organizations seek to move to another level of really treating their employees as their internal customers and trying to establish almost a social movement and a cultural shift of how they think about their employees as part of their internal stakeholders. And we can think of employee engagement as kind of a quick hit or a quick fix. And I'm thinking here about Jacob Morgan's work in his book, Employee Experience Advantage, where by having these short-term small engagements, we can in fact try to make the workplace a better place to work at and have people feel like they're more invested. But also moving more towards even like Ben Witter's book, new book on employee experience, really talking about human centricity. And this is where I like to think about it, moving from professional development into personal development, where we're trying to align the employees' needs and wants and desires and passions with the organization so that they overlap, making for overall a much more committed workforce that's aligned with the employee's purpose as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And for the other panelists, is there anything that you would want to add there, you know, in this topic of employee experience versus employee engagement? And, you know, do you feel like those are the, you know, sort of the same, or is there a different definition there that you think of?
The way I think, Gabe, is that employee engagement is the measure. Employee experience is what we measure. In JetBlue, we always had what Gabe just explained. We didn't call it anything. We just called it how you care about your employees. And the employee engagement surveys were reflecting that engagement and that state of mind and happiness of our employees. And that was connected to compensation. And that's how the cycle was working, and we had this kind of closed loop that ensured that employee experience is part of the strategic roadmap at the executive level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Bob, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Vishal. I just wanted to add our take on it. So I think we're all aligned pretty much, but for us, the employee experience is the entire employee journey and what an employee goes through from pre-hire to retirement, and embedding touch points throughout the employee journey, meaningful touch points, whether it is development or succession planning, whatever the case may be. The entire experience is the employee experience. Engagement is checking up at points in time how engaged that person is during that journey. So it's more of a snapshot in time, whether it's a survey or it's a focus group or we're hosting an event, for years of service, whatever the case may be. So these are various activities along that whole experience journey.
Interesting. So engagement is something that you're measuring, as a result of the overall experience.
Right, and it's more at a point in time. The experience is a whole continuous experience.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah. Yeah, great thought. Bob, let me come to you, because I know a key question that folks who are listening or who are watching might have is, for organizations that are beginning a customer experience transformation, or maybe they've already achieved some inroads in building a customer-centric culture, why should they focus on employee experience?
Well, it's a great question, Gabe. A number of years ago, we used to say happy employees equal happy customers. And today that almost seems trite when you look back at saying that, like, as long as we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, we're all going to be happy employees, and therefore we're going to deliver a happy experience. And it's so much more complicated than that. And so if you're going to embark on this customer experience transformation, who's going to get you there? It's your employees. Organizations are made up of humans and employees. And so pursuing an employee experience, pursuing what the employee perceives as their happiness at an organization and their engagement really is going to drive your ability to deliver a better customer experience. So whether we could debate all day about whether you started first or second. The reality is you have to do both. For years running contact center operations, I was always asked, do you want good service or great revenues? And the answer is always, we want both. And that's the same thing here. You want both a great experience for the employees and for your customers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Richard, I'm curious your perspective here too, in terms of this idea of rationale, customer experience, employee experience. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think at Wells Fargo, for example, in the experience design group, right, we deal with designers. Let's take a concrete example of employees. So we have designers that design experiences for our customers. Well, if their experience, to piggyback on what was said before, if their experience as designers is not good, right, if they're not, the word happy for me is pretty broad, but if they're not satisfied with the value they provide to the organization, then it translates in the work they do. They don't pay attention to details. Maybe they cut corners. Maybe they're not empathetic anymore because they're not happy in their job, right? So the experience of the employees is really important because, as was mentioned before, an employee that's not happy, that can't see the value of why they're doing what they're doing, will translate in what I would call suboptimal experiences, suboptimal work, suboptimal service. And at the end, the only people who are paying for that are your customers or your prospects or whatever, right? So that's my take on it. Yeah,
interesting. It's mitigating that customer experience risk by providing a great employee experience. Yeah, interesting. Right. So Liliana, I want to come to you on this, and Bob sort of touched on this idea that we want everything. So how do you see prioritization here? Should customer experience, employee experience, should these be concurrent efforts? Is there, or do you see, one sort of taking priority over the other in terms of folks who are listening and maybe thinking, where do I start?
I actually think they're the same thing. I think the theory and what we talk about has evolved a lot in terms of how we communicate to the world what customer experience is. To me, employee experience is part of customer experience, and you cannot do one or the other. If you decide to do good customer experience, employee experience falls under that. So the prioritization is not that much of a challenge, I think, because a lot of what we talk about now is not just, empowering employees, but also building technologies that help them serve the customer in a very seamless way. The roadmap of a customer experience journey and what you want the customer experience to look like inevitably will cover touch points that are employee manned, but that need the technology behind to empower those employees in a tangible way. So I don't think there is a conflict with prioritization here. I think if you look at the roadmap as one thing, the sequencing when you start solving the touch points and the journey and you prioritize which touch point you solve for, will inevitably have a portion of it be employee technology and employee processes and procedures and customer-facing things. Just to go back to my portfolio back in the day, I had roughly same percentage-wise investments in employee technology as well as customer technologies, and I think that's why it works so well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Liliana. So Gary, I've heard from Bob and Liliana on this that, these are two concepts that are inexorably intertwined. Is that your assessment as well?
It is, because one of the things that I'd like to talk about around experience design more broadly is the experience ecosystem, and really trying to understand and figure out, and this goes back to the idea of moving from shareholders to stakeholders, really trying to understand what all the experience channels that exist within an ecosystem that we're trying to touch upon and make work together. And I liken it to a car that's tires are out of alignment. You can still get down the road, but the ride's going to be really bumpy and not enjoyable. But you can still get down the road, but just be better to be aligned. So the idea is to think about how these various elements integrate. And so it's this idea that context matters. And so if I redesigned a call center training program for a company last winter, and it was really an EX program to achieve CX ends, because there's no way we're going to make for a better customer experience given the structures that the workers in the call center were operating under. And so the goal was to make a more flexible, employee-centric kind of orientation and approach, which with metrics that really reflected what valued in the interactions versus something that was more standardized and top-down and regimented and micromanaged. So you really have to think about how these things come together, and I really appreciate the points about the journey, because we're all bringing different things to these interactions. And so then we have to be mindful of the world our employees are moving in and living in and what they're trying to deal with and overcome, along with what our customers are trying to move with and deal with and overcome as they're coming to this one point in time where they're interacting with one another.
Yeah, great point. Richard, I'd love your thoughts here too. I think we're hearing some commonalities in that. We can't divorce these things, but I'd love to hear if you agree, disagree, have a different perspective.
No, I actually agree. And leading a design group at Wells Fargo, I have to say that employee experience in regards to, let's say, designers and researchers and everybody around building the experience is so critical, because you're representing, in a way, you're representing the voice of the customer, right? And I would extend that. I'm not, I don't lead a call center or things like that, but I would say the same logic applies across the board. Let's say you're in accounting. Well, if you're in accounting, your experience in that kind of a group has an impact on customers. Therefore, it depends. Like, some people are closer to the experience, some people are more remote, but at the end of the day, as an employee, if your experience as an employee across that journey that was described is miserable, or you're not happy, or you're not fulfilled, then the function you're providing that ultimately support the experience of the customer will be impacted. So I do believe that, some people, I think, don't see it the same way, because the closer you are to the customer, the more I believe your experience as an employee is critical, because you're right at the cusp of that interaction. But I think even people on the back end have also some kind of influence on the experience, right? So sometimes I realize we don't consider the experience of those people. But I think ultimately, I agree with everything that was said, is that the experience of your employees is critical at the end of the day for the experience of your customers.
Yeah, Yeah, so I think, we have panel agreement that, this is critically important, and, these efforts are happening concurrently to, understand how the employee experience is helping to create a better customer experience or really hindering providing great experience. So now that we're all agreement here, let's talk about barriers, because Bob, in CX, we know that there are some legacy mindsets that can really serve as barriers to transformation, but the same can also be true when it comes to employee experience. So, what are some common legacy mindsets that are barriers to affecting change with employee experience?
So the first one that comes to mind, Gabe, is "this too shall pass." So we roll out an employee experience program in a company, and we do balloons and town halls and posters and programs, and the employee sits back with their arms folded and says, "Give it a few months, we'll move on to something else." So that translates into a barrier, because now you get the early adopters. It's almost a little bit like technology. You get early adopters who go out and buy it right away. You get the middle of the road that kind of wait for the prices to come down. And then you get the people that are laggards that never want to participate in it. And so that barrier of "I'll just wait and see what happens" really translates into who's going to ascribe to the new way of operating in an organization under the customer experience guys, and who needs to, we call it who's going to get on the bus or who's going to get off the bus. And sooner or later, that's the barrier you have to overcome. Yeah. Just one thought comes to mind.
Yeah, "this too shall pass." I love that. Vishal, what are some barriers that come to mind for you?
So I'm going to come to the barriers in 1 second, but I just wanted to go back a little bit to the customer experience and employee experience piece, because in healthcare it means a lot. And I do want to reiterate the point that was made earlier. Sometimes we consider employees or team members who are not in direct contact with a customer as their experience not having that much importance. In a healthcare setting, it has been, Gallup does a poll, but we have proven that organizations where engagement is in the top quartile, if you compare those with organizations where engagement is in the bottom quartile, the difference in patient safety incidents is 58%.
Wow.
58%. So can you imagine airline industry? You can extrapolate this anywhere else, right? And every individual in healthcare wants to do the right thing, mostly, right? They're there to serve. Nobody works in healthcare and says, "I want to create a patient safety incident." So the individual intent is there. Despite that, if engagement is in the bottom quartile, there's 58% higher patient safety incidents, which impacts, of course, the customer experience, right?
Yeah, wow.
So that's one piece. Now, in terms of barriers, humongous. Burnout is huge. That's a major. In healthcare, the suicide rates are the highest in any profession. So I think burnout is huge. Culture, depending on the organization, is huge. The mindset where they're not seen in tandem, that employee engagement and customer engagement happen at the same time, right? And need to be addressed at the same time. And it shouldn't be one more thing for me to do as a leader to my team members. It has to be driven from the teammates. I think that mindset sometimes can be a barrier. And another barrier in organizations, especially, that are profit-driven, or even us, we are not profit-driven, but how do you show an ROI on engagement? It's fluff. It's nice to have, that is a big barrier.
Sure.
And we've been able to show some serious movement at Parkland. We're a county hospital where we don't turn anyone away. About 40% of our patients can't afford to pay anything. So we're funded by the town, by the taxpayers. And I just wanted to share one quick slide. So based on our employee engagement efforts, our turnover. Are you able to see my screen?
I am not able to. Okay.
I can see it.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. So the turnover rate went from 18.5% to 14.5%, and we were able to quantify that 1 percentage point is $3.6 million. So as our employee engagement goes up in the orange line, turnover comes down. So in 1 year, fiscal 2017 to 2018, we saved $9 million for the organization. The other thing is patient experience is also in the orange line, and I showed the two in orange lines to see that they move in tandem. So our customer experience and our patient experience, our employee experience and our customer experience are moving at the same time. I think if we are able to share information like this, the buy-in is there in terms of investing in it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Great proof points. Richard, let me come to you on this topic of barriers, because I know folks who are listening all face different barriers in their organization. What are some barriers that come to mind for you when it comes to this sort of change effort?
Right. Well, for me, I feel pretty strongly about the fact that the biggest barrier to a great employee experience, in fact, it's true for anything in life, I think, human experience, is that, the only judge of a good employee experience is the employee himself or herself. At the end of the day, no matter as a corporation how you try to survey, measure, like employee experience, for example, if the human is not candid about the experience he or she is facing, then as an organization, you're not getting anything. So the biggest barrier is to get your employees to open up and to be candid about what is their personal experience in your organization. If you can't achieve that, everything else is irrelevant. And one of the barrier, I think, along that line is that I do not believe that managers, because, if you're an employee, you have a manager, and that manager is responsible to improve your experience and the value you bring to the company and develop you, right? I think managers are not equipped most of the time to get that employee to open up. And if that doesn't happen, then that's the barrier right there. You'll never know what kind of experience your employees are having. You may think you know, but you won't. And I think that's the barrier that every manager needs to break down, is how do you establish that relationship with your employees to get them to talk about their experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So any strategies or tactics to overcome that? How do you break that down?
Well, it's not trivial, and actually, it's funny because this morning, actually, I was on there was a little webinar on MIT Sloan, and there's a lady who was talking about, for example, techniques about what she called radical candor, and as a manager to be able to open up your people, that requires a change for yourself. Like, you need to listen more. You need to be able to be empathetic. I mean, there's all kind of techniques, human techniques, but fields of psychology, or it's the same techniques we're using for customer experiences. But you got to listen to them, and you got to get them to open up, right? Yeah. So it's not a trivial task.
Yeah, great point. So, I know Vishal talked about, really the ROI, showing ROI as being breaking down barriers. Richard talked about sort of that human element and getting staff to share with their managers. Liliana, I'm curious, what are some barriers you've seen, and how do you go about breaking them down?
My big pet peeve is the voice of the employees is not always in the right rooms when we design roadmaps and solutions. My example is our gate agents at JetBlue. When we were designing the solution for them at the gate, it was pretty hard to connect their need to the people that were building the solution because we have silos. In our design, it worked perfectly fine, but I had a very strong team that went above and beyond, that was made of former people who used to do the job. So we had that person that used to be at the gate be the designer and the communicator to the technology team to really be able to say, hey, this button doesn't work. or even if you think it's an amazing thing, nobody would click on it. That whole relevancy of creating tools that really work well for the end user, in that case, the employee, getting that communication and that connection in an operational level is very hard. So for me, it's the silos that we still have in our organizations that are a big obstacle to creating that employee experience. I've seen it when we broke the silos, and it's a very beautiful moment. But it is very hard to do this on a day-to-day basis. And how we should think about breaking those silos really is redesigning teams to have these cross-functional meetings, and to have, whenever we design any type of experience, to make sure that we have the real person that's going to use this day in and day out, or that is at the very, very front, that can bring that empathetic view of what we're doing this and for whom.
Yeah. I love in your story how you involved the employees who are closest to the problem to try to help build the solution. I mean, what a great employee experience driver, and in terms of feeling valued. That's awesome.
Yeah. And then everything else kicks off, right? Like the brand ambassadors, they become it does much more than just making them part of the design. It makes them so proud of that their tool, and they made it. And that is amazing feeling.
Yeah, wonderful. Gary, I know you've worked with a lot of companies and different challenges. So what are some barriers that you've seen to employee experience transformation?
Yeah, there's been so many great things mentioned. I think if I was going to try to kind of encapsulate a lot of them, all of them all together, it would be, why are you doing this in the first place? What are the reasons? It doesn't have to be one reason, but what are the reasons why we're embarking on this effort to begin with? And I know this is an issue in CX as well, right? Sometimes organizations are going to say things like, we should be doing customer experience because everyone else is doing customer experience. So it's kind of like leading by being the first one in the parade, but not really being quite sure as to what are the goals we're trying to achieve, and trying to set those up as a more longitudinal strategy. Right. And there might be some very short-term, easy things we want to accomplish by doing, as Richard was talking about, radical candor. I'm working with a company right now on ethnographic interviewing to understand what makes a certain employee so good at what they do and trying to capture that. Or whether it be like Liliana was talking about, just listening to the people that you're trying to design for and using participatory design methods and ethnographic insights through analyzing work in context. Or talking what Vishal was talking about around culture and burnout and ROI. These are things that both situate in the short term as things that we can probably get a handle on if we, as Bob was talking about, get beyond the this too shall pass and give them the skills they need, as well as long-term multi-quarterly goals of by what time do we expect to see a certain ROI on this and by what metrics. And really thinking about, are we measuring what matters for the efforts we're trying to achieve? And the legacy metrics you have might not be the best metrics for the organization you're trying to create. And attrition has long been thought of as a metric of bad employee engagement. Well, it might be a metric of good employee experience if you're training people so well that they're finding better opportunities elsewhere. And so, how are these things, how are these metrics indicators of what we're trying to achieve? Why are we trying to achieve them? And really articulating that message to the organization in ways that matter to them so that everyone feels like they can get on board with this effort and it's not just the latest flavor of the month.
Yeah.
I'd like, if I may, actually, this is Richard. If I may, I want to applaud what was said, because I think was one of the biggest barrier to an employee experience is knowing the why. There's a lot of people, like working in a bank, for example, we have a lot of regulations, right? And if you're a designer, for example, and you're used to work, let's say at Google, and you come to work in a bank, you could easily get frustrated because they're moving as fast. And if you don't understand why we do governance reviews and things like that, if you don't understand, then you'll get frustrated. So understanding the why, I think, is crucial. And if you combine that with, radical candor, sometimes people will say, as a manager, well, I would love to explain them the why, but I don't know the why myself. And I think part of being candid is to go up the chain of command and say, I do not understand, my people do not understand why we are doing what we're doing. And I think it's coming out of fear. Or being embarrassed, right? So I think the whys, understanding the whys, plus the candor to go up to ask the why, I think are two important things, but they're very difficult to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone, this is such a great discussion. And at this point, I want to just remind participants that you can absolutely submit questions. We will have a little bit of time here at the end of our discussion today to hopefully answer some questions. So please do that if there are some that are coming to your mind. Bob, I want to come back to you because I was sort of smiling in recognition at the description of the person who folds their arms and says, "This too shall pass." So how, for people who also recognize that on the call as they're listening, how does one reach that person? How is that barrier overcome?
Well, I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is, and we've talked about this on the call, in that we have to change behaviors and we have to help people adjust to a new behavioral standard that we're putting into place within an organization. So let me give you an example. I worked for a very large global company, and one day the CEO sent out a note and said, effective immediately, we're all going to be customer focused. And everybody got all excited about it. And about 30 days later, my finance manager came to me and said, your credits are going up. And I said, my credits are going up? Why is that? So I called a group of agents into my office. I said, what's going on? They said, we're being customer focused. I said, what are you talking about? Well, we thought we were customer focused before. The CEO said we have to be customer focused now. So we're giving away more stuff to be more customer focused. So we didn't change the behaviors. And so had we changed and helped employees say, here's how we're going to get, and Liliana talked about the journey, here's how we're going to get from point A to point B in this new environment, we can help them along. That being said, there may come a time where those employees that have their arms folded, that are waiting for it to pass, need to make a decision on their own to say, I don't want to be a part of this organization anymore. I signed up for this and they're becoming this, and I don't like what's happening over here. And we may have to help employees respectively exit an organization if they're not willing to get with where we're trying to lead the organization in the experiences, both for the employee and the customer.
Yeah, great point, Bob. So let me ask, because I know, folks who are listening may be thinking, okay, this is all great, and we have heard some great case studies, but people are thinking, how do I get this transformation started in my own organization? So Gary, are there case studies or success stories that you can share so folks can actually start to understand how they should get started?
Sure. I just want to start with, because Bob is identifying the prime difference between a metric and an indicator, right? So we have a metric that's a measure of something, credits, but what's it mean? And people often confuse metrics and indicators that in some way, shape, or form, it's obvious what the metric stands for. And so I think it's just, I'm going to steal that example, Bob, so thank you for that. I'll definitely use it in class, because to them, it was an indicator of what they were supposed to be doing. For the managers, it was, no, this is not appropriate thing. So I think it's a brilliant example of how we can confuse the two things. Going to the idea of how to get started and what to do. Again, I think that companies, it depends on what level, right? I think in many ways, I talk with folks that I both teach and consult with, trying to create a social movement within your organization. There's been a lot said that leadership matters and it's a top-down approach. And while that can be true as an approach, And like one of the examples I'd love to talk about is Patagonia, as really did start from the top with, you look at the book by Yvon Chouinard, Let My People Go Surfing. It's really a quintessential example of, at the very beginning, this is who we are and this is what we're going to be. But at the same time, I think focusing on the small wins, it's enabling people, like Bob's example, right? It's enabling people to have some kind of ownership, autonomy, ability to adapt and construct what it is that they're doing, and really shifting managers from the philosophy of being managers to facilitators. And I think a lot of, like, human resources departments are going away for people's departments. Those are larger shifts, but they really are also smaller shifts in how we think about what our role is and what the purpose of us is vis-a-vis our customers, and how managers move from facilitators to treating their own employees as customers. So I think if it all seems too much, think about what small changes can we start to make to really get around this human centricity, this voice of the employee, getting to where the work gets done and making it easier for people to do what they are trying to do and give them a clear purpose as to why we are all engaged in doing this. You know, going with start with why, we're more than the products we produce, we're about the mission we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah, great thoughts, Gary. And Vishal, I want to come back to you. Folks who are wondering, how do I get started?
Yeah, so I'd love to share what we did at Parkland. We went from having 22 teams in Tier 1 to 130-something now. Tier 1 is where someone can raise their hand and stop the line, so to speak, without any fear of repercussion. And it's exactly what everybody said so far. It's funny, but in terms of the how, what we did was we do an employee engagement survey like most organizations do. But what we did this time is did a quick regression to identify 3 things that impact employee engagement, the difference between metrics and indicators. So we identified 3 things that impact employee engagement at Parkland. And in terms of enabling the team members, is the action planning did not start from the chiefs or the C-suite to the employees. It started from the front line and funneled to the chiefs. So, for example, the biggest pain point or opportunity was my team works well together, right? So that was the employee objective. So in terms of cascading it and how we set it up, the inverted pyramid is first in their huddles or shift lineups or whatever we call, the team members discussed what 2 things can we do that will show that we work well together. And that was their action plan. Simple as that. Very, very simple, but it was within their control. For some teams, it's, and I'm being facetious here, holding hands and saying a prayer before they start work. For some, it's going out for a beer at the end of the month or whatever the case may be, right? Whatever it is, it has to make sense. It's teammate engagement. The solution, the how, what is being done has to come from the teammates. While the data, we can use that to say, okay, what it is that's most important that our teammates have told us, we have to enable them in the solutioning. And we're doing the same thing for our customer experiences. The teammates design the interventions. Then when we cascade it next level, again, you said facilitators. I love that. That's precisely what we're doing. So our supervisors and managers, their action plan, so in that department, they get together, what 2 things can we do to support the action plan of our team members? That's their action plan. And then it cascades to the directors. What 2 things can we do to support our supervisors' action plans? And then the vice presidents and all the way down to the chiefs. And it's very transparent. So a team member, and this also ties the purpose of why, right? So a team member at the front line is able to see what it is my team agreed. So how will my supervisors support us? How will the directors support the supervisors, and all the way down to the chief? So it's transparent. And that has helped us move. So our engagement in survey participation used to be 49% in 2015. In last year, it was 88%. So 88% of our staff members participated in the engagement. So I think enabling the frontline team members and being very, very transparent and focusing in on lesser number of things, but giving them the opportunity to fix their life. Like we're heightening their purpose and removing the roadblocks for their purpose. for them to
Yeah.
achieve their purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, great tangible examples. Super impressed. Richard, I want to come back to you here. Where do people get started?
Well, number one is I think we need to acknowledge, like on this webinar, for example, right? Different people are coming from different level in the organization. So number one is you got to acknowledge where do you start is very contextual. And I like what was said previously is like the different level in the organization, there's different things you can do. But I think where to start is to recognize that employee experience is not something that is solely driven from the top. You can have, as an example, Wells Fargo is a large organization. Different organization within Wells Fargo may have different levels of employee experiences, right? But what we encourage people to do from the front, you may be just a designer, is that you can trigger a good experience for your colleagues around you, right? So if you're on this call right now, number one is determine where you are in your organization, and then you need to understand what your team needs to do to change. Even if you don't have the big picture, understanding the why and start looking around you. What are those simple things you can do to improve the experience of your colleagues, to your team, to your managers, people above you, to your stakeholders, and things like that. If you're on this call and you happen to be in the C-suite, well, obviously you're setting the tone for the organization. Where do you start? Is you got to empower people to understand why the organization is going where it's going and why it needs to change. So my advice is, where do you start is number one, look at your surrounding, where you are in your organization, and don't wait for, we hear that sometime in organization. People say, it's not my job. I'm way down in the weeds. I'm in the front line. I'm waiting for the CEO well, that's not an answer. You can impact things around you, around the employee experience. Determine what can you impact in the realm of what you're supposed to do in the organization. And again, be candid, go up the chain and say, I would like to understand some things, and maybe you'll impact change upward. Yeah. So, you know what I'm saying? So bottom line here is that where you start is, number one, acknowledge where you are. Number two is, don't wait for executive direction to tell you exactly where to change. Start with your own group, do what you can do, pick some simple things, and show by example, right?
Yeah. Great point. And Bob, I want to go to Bob and then Liliana. Slightly different twist on the same question. One of our audience questions came in. It says, how do I get started as someone who's new to an organization? How can I best take advantage of having that outsider viewpoint? So Bob, let's go to you first.
Thanks, Gabe. So I've been a outsider at a number of different times in companies, and I got some sage advice from a CEO one time that I've really kind of lived by since then. I was just hired for the company. I was hired to come in and do a customer experience transformation, kind of typical of what you hear these days about people being given the CX experience. And he sat me down and he said, we didn't get to be a billion dollar organization over these last 50 years because we didn't know what we were doing. We got here because we knew what we were doing. We just need some help. So spend the first 60 days you're on board here listening, and then bring in your perspective, as opposed to trying to be a white knight in shining armor coming in to save the company and to save the experience. And I really live by that. And spending those first few weeks listening to all levels, all functions, all responsibilities in the organization, then paint your picture and see where you need to take the next steps. It's almost like doing a journey map, right? You need to understand where the touch points are, and then look for the pain points and solve them. So that's my advice: is listen a lot, formulate your experience, and then take it back out to the organization to build that credibility.
Yeah, and I love that because you're demonstrating, you're showing that active listening automatically sort of gets you that credibility. So I love that tactic. Liliana, same question. As an outsider, any advice that you would give our listener?
I hate to say, but I would start with a cross-functional group. that would start talking about the experience. I know it's not very action driven, but the beginning is just about listening. And I think it's important that, you look at the customer experience and then get the people that are delivering this experience in a group setting and talk about what are their challenges, to hear and be present and use this whole empathy towards the employees to hear their stories. That's how we mapped out the needs of our employees. That's how we were able to build the right solutions. It really starts with listening, but also giving them the goal, right? So if you don't have the strategic framework to tell them what they're supposed to deliver, it's kind of a tough conversation. So get your people together and show them what's the customer experience you want to deliver, and then ask them why today that's not possible. And you will be amazed to see how many people will come out and tell you amazing things about what you can help them with.
Yeah, great thought. So question just for general for any panelist who wants to answer this one. Our employees have been clear in indicating that the systems we provide them has created more workarounds and more work, which is impacting the customer experience. They're frustrated. Their morale is waning as a result. Can anyone address how they may have handled a situation where systems and technology have impacted customer engagement?
All right, I'll take a stab at this. It's Gary. So one of the things that, I'm a sociologist in a user experience program. I teach a course on ethnography for experience design. And one of the key elements in trying to design systems is to, and it's actually taking on the outsider's perspective we just talked about, really trying to understand the workplace practices that we're trying to support with the system so that it's designed to support those kinds of functionalities. And very often, I've done some work on enterprise system implementations, there's a sense that the people we're designing for are actually the CIOs or the vice presidents of technology, information technology. And there are very good reasons why they want certain features in those systems, like with an electronic health record system that Michelle, I'm sure, is very familiar with. At the same time, when those kinds of systems interfere with how people do their work, especially when they don't feel they've had any buy-in into how this thing is designed and constructed, then it can be intensely demoralizing. And I'm experiencing this right now with a project that shall remain nameless at my university. So if I was going to start a project like this, kick it off, I would make sure, going back to Liana's point, cross-functional team from across the organization hierarchy that can engage in really trying to understand what we're trying to support and facilitate, along with what features do we need present to try to get a handle at the enterprise level of what's going on, so that even if the workflow does change, people understand why it's changing and there's a reason for it. And there's an honest assessment of what the limitations of the systems, what the limitations are. There's nothing worse than being told this system is going to be great, it's a lie, and then when it goes live, it's a disaster. No one likes that. Don't do that.
We get a lot of laughter out of recognition, I think, of your statement.
There. But, also to add, I would say it's not so complicated. And sometimes that's where you hear my passion on these webinars. It's not that complicated. Just involve the people that are going to use this every day in the design. I just don't understand why this is such a difficult concept for organizations to actually build in their operational integrity processes. It should be the way we do business. Why on earth would you design something without the person that's going to be using it being there? It's just, to me, mind-boggling.
Preach.
Well, this is Richard. I think that question, if it's coming from Jerry, context is key here, right? If we're talking about the bank, for example, Jerry, I'm living your challenges every single day, right? So we got to be careful here, because what you would do to solve for a bank may not be the same thing as what you would do to solve for a medium-sized, non-regulated organization, right? So I think in this case, one of the things we do at Wells Fargo is, if we're talking about designers, for example, hitting walls in regards to technologists on agile teams saying, can't do this, can't do that, what we're doing is we're ramping up our designers to have better skills of what we call facilitative leadership. or design rationale where you absolutely need to challenge in a constructive way your technologists about why that great experience cannot be done. And in a bank, I think this is more acute, and probably as well in the healthcare industry, because they're both highly regulated. But there's a lot of tools, Jerry, that you can get to kind of equip your people to engage into constructive conversation with people who are resisting implementing great experiences. So would be happy to provide references about that.
I would like to add something. This is Vishal. In line with that, I thank you for that comment. Very, very apt. But what we've done is every time we have a new initiative, we do engage the individuals that will be dealing with it in an advisory capacity. They're not decision-making. It's very important that we set the parameters. We share the why, and we have their input in the concept and the actual workflow design. The other thing is what I created initially when I started, I was an FTE of 1 and needed some help. So we have an employee engagement task force. They're employee and customer experience, like we've talked about throughout. But they're a small ecosystem of the organization. So I have 106 individuals, and that task force is in the same ratio as the workforce in disciplines and in hierarchy, and also in demographics. It's not an exact replica of the demographics, but it's similar. So not only do we have individuals engage with the workflow project hands-on, but we also take it in, in the process, the people who service the individuals which is going to be impacted and the people who they service, internal customers, right? So if you have a department that receives goods from another department, I'm oversimplifying, and then does something to it and sends it to the next department, if we're working on changing technology or implementing a project for this department in the middle, not only do we have these individuals giving feedback, but then once that is somewhat crystallized, we share it with the individuals across so that we have an input, and it's not that we need to pull back after we have implemented something. It's easier said than done, but that's what we've been doing. And the task force has really engaged the people, and our teammates are super excited. And we also have a patient family advisory council. So things that will impact our consumers, we have a consumer advisory council that looks at it again before we roll it out.
Yeah. So I know we got a few minutes left here before I want to turn it over to Maisa. So my last question to you all, 30 seconds or less. I'm going to keep you to your answer here. I'm a skeptical executive. I'm asking you, why should we invest in employee experience? You've been telling me we're too internally focused. We need to focus on our customers. I get it. Now I'm hearing we need to invest in employee experience. 30 seconds or less. Why should we do that? Bob, I'm going to put you on the spot to get us started.
Well, I mean, my first reaction is, why are you separating the two? These are linked, and hopefully the comments we've made today have proven that you can't have a great employee experience, a great customer experience without a great employee experience. So it's not a dual investment. It's one investment in improving the experience of your organization for both employees and customers.
Gary?
Yeah, I would say that the extent that you care about your customers is reflected in how you treat your employees, and that especially as you move out into a larger brand identity in a space of social responsibility, the ways in which we treat our employees as people is going to also reflect in our larger brand, and also thereby creating a greater brand identity for people who really respond to that message of we care about all people, not just people who are using our products.
Yeah. Richard?
Well, great organization relies on great teams, and great teams takes time to build. If you do not pay attention to your employee experiences, they will leave, and you will be constantly rebuilding teams, and that will take away from having great teams because it takes time to build them. That's why you want to retain your teams and you want to care about their experience. And once you get that, then that great team can start doing great things for your company, including great customer experiences.
Vishal?
I will sum it up in one word: sustainability. sustainability of the organization. That's why you do customer experience. That's why you do employee experience, and it can actually have an impact on the bottom line, which is proven. And of course, if you don't sustain your teammates, you can't sustain your customers, and it goes on.
Yep, Liliana.
Because I want to preserve and optimize your already made experience, investment in customer experience. Because if you don't invest in employee experience, the people that deliver your customer experience, we are not going to deliver the ROI of all the customer experience investments we already have done.
Yeah. Panelists, thank you for your thought leadership and for your insight. Maisa, I want to turn it over to you for closing thoughts. Maisa, are you there? All right. Maisa may be experiencing some technical difficulties. Well, I'll go ahead and close this out unless she breaks in on me here. Again, thank you to all who attended. Hope that you got some great insight from our panelists today. I know if there are any additional questions, I'm sure our panelists would be perfectly fine with you reaching out to them. So thank you for attending this webinar of Corinium Global Intelligence. We appreciate them. So take care, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Take care. Bye.